Question 6 in the Germany section of paper 1 will ask you to identify which of 2 bullet points or factors do you believe was the most important. The highlighted part at the top is always the same. It will ask you which of the following was the more important, and then it will give you something to focus on. So we've got that here in red, Hitler establishing a dictatorship in Germany. There's our 2 bullet points underneath we'll need to talk about. So here we've got legislative changes, basically means law, in 1933, and Hitler taking on the title of Fuhrer in 1934. Now, as always, at the bottom, that will stay the same as well. Explain your answer with reference to both bullet points, and that really is key there. For a good mark, you want to talk about both factors. This is a 12-mark question, so we're hoping to produce about 15 minutes worth of writing, 3 decent-sized paragraphs. Of course, if your grade is slightly lower, that you're aiming for a target, then 1 paragraph, talk about the most important, or 2 will be okay. The ideal world, 3 paragraphs, looking at each bullet point in a separate paragraph, and then a conclusion that answers that question. Which was the more important and why? Now, skills like change, significance, why it was important, cause and consequence are the skills you can use for this question. You just need to pick one of those and explain it really well in your answer. And let's look how we do that. So the first thing is just to briefly make some notes by each bullet point. Just before you start writing, think about how did each lead or contribute to the event in the question, which had the biggest impact and why. Think about that, and you can choose either bullet point here. I'll talk about that after. So for my notes, I don't want to write too much, but I've just put there 1933, protection of the people and state. That's where communists were banned. And then the Enabling Act later on gave him powers without the Reichstag backing him. And then in 1934, well, he became Fuhrer when he replaced Hindenburg, the president. The army was loyal. That gave him complete power. And the other things I'm going to write about, it's just good to get those out of your head before you start, just a few seconds of planning. Once you've done that, we're ready to start writing. So start off with bullet point 1 and how it contributed to the factor in the question. And the first thing to do is just state the point of your paragraph or the theme that you'll be discussing. So here, legislative changes, I've just said. Legislative changes in 1933 had a large impact on Hitler establishing a dictatorship. Again, I'm focused on that question, as they helped him to remove the democratic rules of the Weimar government and helped him have more power than he should have had as Chancellor. Then I wanted to develop that paragraph, just give some evidence, examples to prove that. So I've just written down here, these changes included the protection of the people and state law that works on the concept that the communists were a threat to national security after the Reichstag fire and so banned them from parliament. The Enabling Act is another example of a legislative change that allowed Hitler to create or make laws without the backing of the Reichstag for 4 years. Now, I've made a good start there. I've got some good knowledge. What I'm looking to do is explain, analyse, bring in my own knowledge. And that's the main bulk of the paragraph here. How does that link to a dictatorship? These changes allowed Hitler to begin to establish a dictatorship, as they allowed him to have more power over Germany than he was entitled to as Chancellor. By removing the communists from the Reichstag, it removed one of his main political opponents, meaning he would have a greater chance of passing laws in the future. He was also able to arrest 4,000 communists and have their newspapers shut down, which helped him gain control over his main opponents. The Enabling Act linked on from this by being an accepted legislative change by the Reichstag to allow Hitler the power to make laws without needing the approval of the Reichstag for 4 years. This meant that Hitler could do as he wished, with only Hindenburg able to stop him as president. And this showed Hitler was beginning to seize more control over Germany and establish a dictatorship. And then finally, I just want to link back. Why was this important? So, overall, legislative changes in 1933 were important to Hitler becoming a dictator, as they slowly gave him more power than he should have been allowed as Chancellor, and allowed him to begin to target removing his opponents in large numbers, which are both linked to a dictatorship. So this is roughly what that paragraph would look like, roughly about 10 lines or so on paper. And if we just look at where we've got those key areas again, there's my theme to begin with. Here's some examples or descriptions of what happens. The bulk of my paragraph is me analysing that with own knowledge and detail linked to the question. And then I've just linked back at the end. Why was it important? What did it allow? Now, once I've done that with one bullet point, to get higher marks, I'm going to look to do that with a second as well. Exactly the same structure, a theme or a point, then some evidence and examples, then an explanation of how this links to the factor, and I'll link that back to the question at the end. So this one looks at Hitler becoming Fuhrer in 1934. Hitler becoming Fuhrer in 1934 was also key to him becoming a dictator, as it meant he could now take the title of president, as well as chancellor. He combined these into the title Fuhrer, and this gave him total control over Germany. By becoming Fuhrer, it gave him even more power. For example, the army had to swear loyalty to him, not Germany, and it also meant there was nobody now who could legally stop him from being a dictator. These actions were very important to Hitler becoming a dictator, as although he had the power to pass any laws he wished, as shown in Night of the Long Knives, where he murdered people within the Nazi Party who might oppose him, such as Rommel, the president, Hindenburg, still had the legal power to stop Hitler if he had wished, as he held more power over him. The army could also have been used to remove Hitler from power on Hindenburg's orders. Therefore, by becoming Fuhrer when Hindenburg died, it meant there would be no future president, and nobody with more power than Hitler in Germany, finalising his dictatorship. By forcing the army to swear loyalty to Hitler, it also meant he could do as he wished, and would have their backing always. Overall, Hitler becoming Fuhrer in 1934 was also very important to him to establish a dictatorship, as it meant he now finally had full control over Germany and could not legally be stopped. So, just highlight those key points again. There's my theme, there's a bit of description and some examples, here's my main analysis there with some good knowledge, and then I'm linking back afterwards. Now, I've analysed both bullet points there. What I've not done is I've not actually answered the question, which was more important. So we're going to move on to our conclusion now. You have to pick one. Do not say they were both equally as important. There's no correct answer, as I'm about to show. Now, for a higher level answer, try and link both bullet points and explain how one of them caused the other to happen. So here's one example of a conclusion. Overall, I believe that whilst both factors were essential in Hitler establishing a dictatorship, I feel that the legislative changes were more important. This is because they allowed Hitler to remove opposition quickly whilst he was Chancellor and gave him the power to make any laws he liked. This allowed him to take on the role of Fuhrer later, meaning that without the legislative changes, he would never have been able to complete his dictatorship of Germany. He needed the Enabling Act to allow him to replace Hindenburg's role without any opposition. Therefore, legislative changes were the most important factor in enabling Hitler to establish a dictatorship. So here in his conclusion, I've picked one side and said why. I've also explained how it led to the other factor as well. But of course, there isn't a correct answer here, so let's flip that conclusion. And here's an example of Hitler becoming Fuhrer being the main reason. Overall, whilst I acknowledge both factors did play a part in Hitler establishing a dictatorship, I feel it is clear that Hitler becoming Fuhrer in 1934 is clearly the more important factor here. Whilst it could be argued that legislative changes gave Hitler more power due to Hindenburg being president and having control of the army, it always meant Hitler was not a dictator and could be stopped. It was not until he became Fuhrer that he truly became a dictator of Germany. Therefore, Hitler becoming Fuhrer in 1934 was the most important reason why Hitler became a dictator, as it gave him the power to protect the legislative changes so nobody could challenge them. So in this conclusion, I'm basically saying, well, yeah, I can say he made the changes in 1933 and they were important, but he's not a dictator until Hindenburg's gone. Hindenburg could always replace him. Once Hindenburg's gone and Hitler becomes Fuhrer, he's then a dictator, and that protects the law changes he put in place beforehand. So what does this look like when it's all together? There's our first paragraph and our first bullet point. This paragraph 2. And then we would pick one conclusion at the end. Which of those two is the most important and why? And try and explain how it led on to the other bullet point there for higher marks. So you've understood the relationship between both. Just a few points to finish on here. First of all, you can see there in red, I highlighted what the focus of the question was. Make sure you do that. Just take a few seconds, make sure you know exactly what you're talking about there, okay? especially this sort of question, you could get mixed up with Hitler becoming Chancellor and Hitler becoming Fuhrer with the dictatorship, because they're quite similar, but there are different historical patterns used there. Now, for a good answer, you need to focus on both bullet points and be clear on how they impacted the factor or the event in question. You will not get a high mark if you just talk about one. Now, you might know other reasons you could write about that impacted the factor, but you're not really going to get marks for those. They've got to link into the bullet points given. So, for example, Knight of the Long Knives could have been one of these bullet points here. And I could have done a paragraph on that if that was the case, but it's not. So I only briefly mentioned Knights of Long Knives and linked that into the bullet point there. You have to talk about the information you're given. And finally, if a bullet point has two ideas in, for example, if it's talking about Nazi control and fear and violence in a bullet point, make sure you make links to both in your paragraph to show a wide range of knowledge. You wouldn't just talk about fear, for example, or just talk about violence. And finally, please make sure you pick one as being the most important at the end. Actually go back and answer that question and explain why. As I've shown here in this answer, there is no correct answer here. You can pick either of them.